So tonight, sound check, understanding what to do and how to use the tools. I will say this, and for a live setting, that was well presented music. And the only way that you are going to achieve that quality of music, whether recorded or live, is by doing a good sound check. Really, I would say 90% of accomplishing our job well is done before the live set ever starts. And most of that has to do with setup and sound check. So this stuff's really quite important, and it's got to be done every time so that we can present as good as we can. I'm going to put this stuff over here. So what is the point of sound check? Proper gain structure, setting up gates, different types of compression structure, EQing an audio signal, and basic setup for in-ear monitors. And the question is, who is sound check for? And a lot of people that are new to what we do, yeah, I can email this to you. A lot of people that are new to running audio, they think that we're running sound check for the benefit of the musicians, and we're not at all. Sound check is first and foremost for us, and if it benefits the musicians, then that's great. And so even though I put basic setup for in-ear monitors in this, that's really like a secondary thing to sound check. We really are not too worried about that. As Larry's pointed out, it is a good way to keep your musicians distracted so that you can get a quality sound check in and people aren't playing random stuff all the time. But really what we're looking for is getting each channel set up well for ourselves, because if we can accomplish that before we get started, then we can do our job well. If we don't accomplish that before we get started, it's really hard to fix once everybody's playing, because what we do affects what they hear, what we hear, all sorts of stuff. So the sooner that we get it out of the way, the better. So sound check is for us, not for musicians or the benefit of them. I mean, it does help them, but it's primarily for us. So before we get started on the tools that we use, we're going to talk about groups of instruments. And we're going to talk about a sound stage. So a sound stage is how you hear things, and it has nothing to do with an actual stage. A sound stage is just the way that music is presented to you. And so you get a different sound stage live versus over-ear headphones versus in-ear headphones versus listening to something on a tablet or a TV. All of those are different types of sound stages. And you hear music and you hear audio differently depending on what your sound stage is. With live music, a lot of people think that live music is the best sound stage because it's most natural, although nowadays it's really not too natural anymore because we're augmenting everything with electricity and stuff, so it's not like it's acoustic. But still, live soundstage is what people like a lot. And what is traditional and common with live soundstage is natural hall reverb or echo. That's why they build like amphitheaters and theaters the way they do. You can even hear it in this room right now. My voice, if we were in a small room, if we were in one of our houses and sitting around a dinner table, you wouldn't have this natural echo that we're getting in this room. So that in live settings, you get that naturally. And then in smaller rooms like this, people like that sound. It's pleasing to them. And so in smaller rooms like this, we try to replicate that with effects like hall reverb and stuff like that. And people can do that with recordings too, but oftentimes when you're recording music to listen to later, you're presenting it with a different sound stage. You're presenting it where everything is very crisp and clean and neat and tidy and everything has its own space and you can hear it all well together. So there's different types of sound stages, and the groups of instruments all fit in. Regardless of the sound stage, they all fit into specific places. And we're going to talk about these in the order that you want to do your sound check with. So we have foundational, chorus, peripherals, and vocals. Foundational instruments to the sound stage are drums, bass, percussion, your low end stuff, anything that's going to fit into your sub or be close to sub. So they provide structure and support. And they fill your mid and low range hertz spectrum range, and they also provide power and volume. And so with your foundational instruments, when I say they provide structure and support, what do I mean by that? I mean that this is the actual foundation of a house that we're building, right? And as we go up, we're going walls and then ceiling. And if we try to build our house from the ceiling down and there's no structure to support it, it's really hard to do that. So our high end and our mid range, our ears are more sensitive to high end audio. So louder high end audio we don't like a lot quicker than we would not like low end audio. So if I have electric guitars and vocalists and they're up loud and I don't have a good foundation, a good structure to support them and give them a place to be, then it's going to sound loud or shrill or unpleasant. But if I have that good foundation, that good structure where I've got loud volume from my foundation, then all that other stuff seems okay. So you would be surprised that you can have high-end audio up pretty decently loud and it will sound loud, but then you bring up your foundation and all of a sudden it's pleasant. It doesn't hurt you anymore. It's not uncomfortable. And so churches kind of have done that bad for a long time because people are afraid of drums, they're afraid of the bass, they're afraid of low end, and it's always like we got to turn stuff down. And we don't want to be loud for the sake of being loud, but we have to know that if we're going to play our music, our worship at a certain volume in the room, then we need to provide it support and structure with foundational instruments so that it does sound good and it's not painful. The drum kit, out of this group, the drum kit is the most confusing to figure out because not the whole kit does not fit into this category. What does is like your kick drum and maybe a floor tom, your really low end stuff that's giving you a lot of bass. And that's the stuff that I want to hear in the sub versus just the house. When I have a drummer who is building a song and he's using that kick drum, which is the large drum at the bottom, by the way, when they're using that kick drum to build a song, I'm going to hear it. But I don't want to just hear it like somebody's clapping their hand. I want to hear it like somebody's hitting me in the chest. And you can actually feel that low end. And it doesn't have to be so aggressive that you're like, oh my gosh, that's loud. But if it's not present, then the rest of your set is going to, the rest of your soundstage is going to feel out of control and not as pleasant. So other things in the kit fit into other categories because it's not filling that super low end. But drums, bass, percussion, stuff like that, that's your foundations. The next thing is chorus. So what we have in this category is acoustic guitars, pianos, sometimes electric guitars, depending on what the electric guitar is doing in your mix. If it is doing chords and they're doing rhythm, or if it's distorted and they're doing, like rocky stuff, then that can be chorus. But if they're doing like high end or lead lines, or they're sometimes playing, sometimes not, then maybe it wouldn't fit in this category. So what does chorus do? It provides stability and rhythm. It provide the root key and allow for harmony, and fills in low mid to high end. So we have four main sections on our hertz range. We have low, we have mid or low mid, high mid, and high. And so these are going to go all the way from low mid to high end. So right there you can say that none of my chorus instruments should be in my sub. Because the more stuff that you shove into the sub, the more you're giving that single diaphragm speaker to do, the more information you're giving it to process. And when we give it too much, we lose integrity and clarity of that low end. And so we really only want to have things from our foundational group in that sub so that we maintain integrity and clarity of that audio that's coming at us. So there's a chorus, provides stability and rhythm. Rhythm is different than timing. Timing is provided to us by the drums and the bass, by the foundation. And the difference between timing and rhythm is I can have a 4/4 song at 100 beats per minute that is like this. That is timing. But then I could have a guitarist play over that 100 different strums. And depending on what strum that guitarist uses, it could be in all sorts of categories of music. If I have a guitar player that is strumming something with like a giddy up rhythm, then that could be country. If I have somebody that's just strumming down a lot, that could be rock. If I have somebody that is palm muting a lot and just kind of, accenting maybe on the first and the second and stuff like that, that could maybe be jazz. But it's all to 100 beats per minute. So there's a big difference between timing and rhythm. So these chorus instruments provide us the rhythm of the song. The other thing is the root key. They allow for harmony. So, all of our music is going to be in the key of something. The key of C, the key of D, the key of A. And these rhythm instruments are really the trunk of the tree for those things. And that allows your other instruments to play on top of them and not necessarily provide you the full picture of that key, but it allows them to accent and build on top of. But if you have the same stuff being played on the outside and you take away that trunk of the tree, that root key, it doesn't sound as good. It sounds kind of all over the place. If I have somebody that's just kind of playing some solo electric guitar, it might sound good, but it's going to sound best with that root key being played in the background. It's something for your ear to latch onto, and then everything played on top of that is extra. So it also allows singers to give harmonies. Harmonies are traditionally, like your root is your melody, so your number one, there's 1 through 7, and then your octave in keys, but traditionally it's 1, 3, and 5. So if that's a little too much for you, don't worry, because we don't need to know that stuff. But these chorus guitars, or these chorus instruments, do provide that root for us. Next up is peripherals. These are going to be usually the instruments on the outside of the stage. That's just the way that we set them up. But what they do are the electric guitar, the violin, sometimes the piano, just like with the electric guitar sometimes. And what they bring is dynamics, lead lines, accents, and mid to high end on your Hertz range, your EQ. And so dynamics are really important with peripherals. The difference between an acoustic set and a good amplified set is it lives and dies with your peripherals. So if I have the worship team up here and Megan's playing away and everybody's playing away, and then I have Bert over here on the side and he's playing some pretty electric lead line, but I can't really hear that, I've totally lost all the dynamic of that song, and it's just gone. I'm basically getting an acoustic set through speakers. And so what brings these songs to life are these iconic lead lines that we hear on the radio or recorded music, or just whatever the musician has prepared, whether that is a solo or their own lead line or whatever. We saw some of that in the video we watched before we started. The electric guitarist, at one point, the main vocalist takes his guitar off and he picks up a tambourine to sing, and at that point the lead guitarist goes into a little solo. That is all dynamic. That is adding emotion and depth to the song that you just don't get without those peripheral instruments. So sometimes piano fits into this category.
So let me interrupt. Would you say he moved from chorus position to peripheral position? Because he was playing in the background at first.
Yeah, probably. We'll have to listen to it a second time, and we'll really see if that is the case. But most likely, yes. Most likely he was playing lightly overdriven, and he was just kind of playing chords and more of like a chorus instrument rather than a peripheral instrument. And then when he goes into that solo, most definitely, without a doubt, he is peripheral. And sometimes that means that we need to be ready for those things. And it doesn't necessarily mean that on the fly I need to re-EQ my electric guitar. But I do need to set it up knowing that that's going to happen. And so it's not necessarily that it needs to all of a sudden increase 10 decibels in volume so that it's like, oh, everybody can hear it. But I need to make sure that when I set up my electric, that people can hear it. So that when he goes into that peripheral section of the music, it's not lost. It's there. It's audible. People are experiencing it. They're feeling it. That's the emotion. That's the depth.
Would you do, like if you notice that you can't hardly hear the guitar, I mean, you would adjust it, right?
Yes, most definitely. Most definitely. The simplest thing that we do in the back is adjust volume.
Yeah.
And most sets are fluid. You're not setting it all up and then standing back and watching. Most sets, it is you are on rough seas and you are constantly readjusting the ship, trying to make sure you stay on course. And the better that you do these concepts, the less adjusting you will do in the live set. The better you get at this stuff, the less you will need to do live. And also, the better your musicians are, the less you will have to do live.
Because they'll compensate.
Better musicians play with a greater amount of stability. They know what they're here to do. They know what they're here to play, and they know how to play those parts. And so you just have less hesitation. You have less changes in volume from them because they could play real soft and quiet if they're nervous, like, oh, I might mess this part up, so I'm going to play quietly in case I mess it up. Or they could be like, oh man, I'm rocking this chorus because I love this part of the song. Whereas the more professional of a musician that you get, the less they will do those things. They will play consistently throughout a song. And they can feel the music without playing harder or hitting the drums harder. You can do all of those building things. And sometimes you do want to hit things harder, but not always. So the better your musicians are, the less you'll have to do. But the better we are, the less we'll have to do live. I don't think you'll ever get it to a point, at least I've never experienced it, where you set it up so perfectly that they go to play a 30-minute live set and you're just sitting back there going like, yeah, I did that perfect. Like I've never had that happen. But you will have to do less. Sometimes the piano, I did want to mention that, just like with that question from Larry, with how the electric guitar moved from a chorus instrument to a peripheral instrument. A lot of times in our setting, the piano is going to be a chorus instrument, but there are times that it transitions into a peripheral instrument. Like this last Sunday, Aaron was here, and he was up there, and on the last song that they played, Aaron and Dano played a lead line together. And Aaron was playing the octave of what Dano was playing. And in that moment, the piano was a peripheral instrument and not a chorus instrument. And so sometimes you have people that play the keys and they play them more often than not peripherally, and sometimes, a lot of times, in worship settings, people will play them chorus more often than not. But
Well, question, given that happened,
mm-hmm.
the guy mixing the sound, really, it's kind of his call what he wants to really accent.
Right.
So, I mean, it's kind of a toss-up whether you want more of that or more of this.
Right. Yes.
I mean, I'm sure there's a right and a reason, but there's not a
Yes.
perfect answer.
Yes. Audio is kind of like a soft science in that there is technicality to it, but it's also an art. We're playing an instrument, and they can play whatever they want, but until I unmute the channels and I set them up and I give them volume, nobody's hearing it.
Yeah.
So we're playing an instrument, and it very much is how you play an instrument. But like all instruments, you can learn to play them better. So there, sometimes I might come to you and say, hey, this should be this way. And it's okay if you were like, well, here's why I did it. Here's why I did it that way. And if you give me a reason that is like, this is my artistic flavor to the song, and I'm like, cool, I will totally be like, cool. But If there's something technically wrong with the way that you're doing it, then I'll be like, okay, that's a good thought, but here's the technical reason why it should be different. And so we can have conversations. It's not just that you're wrong and you're wrong. Like we have conversations. If you have two different guitar players, they're going to play very differently. They're going to have different pedals, they're going to have different amps, different, brands. And so it very much is, a flavor instrument. Like, how do you like doing it? But we can all be better at it. Lastly is the vocals. The vocals are the hardest thing to really put words to because everybody's voice is so different. Female, male, what style of music are they playing over? What instruments are they playing over? Who's bringing what to the set? So really what you're doing with vocals is that they fit well in the mix and they stand out. In secular music, the vocals do not stand out as much as they do in worship style music. And that can be Christian, Catholic, whatever you want it to be. Worship music will have vocals stand out more because the reason is you're having people in a congregation that are invited in to sing words that mean more than I like this song. Where secular music does not do that. So when you listen to the two styles of music, secular and worship is going to accentuate vocals more. That does not mean that we push those vocals up super loud because we're hopefully presenting a professionally mixed set. And yes, the vocals should stand out enough that we can all sing the songs together, but not so much that it's like all I can hear is the vocals and the acoustic, and there's a bunch of other people up there, but this is worship, and the vocals and the acoustic are what matter. And a lot of churches do that. You have a full team, sometimes 10 plus people on the stage playing all sorts of instruments, and you can hear 3 people. You can hear the main vocalist, their chorus instrument, and probably the foundational, either the bass or the drums, and everything else just kind of gets lost because this is church and the vocals are important. So yeah, a lot of times it does.
This is how we want the music played.
Yes, a lot of times it does. So yes, we do want the vocals to stand out, but they're not the only thing that's important in our sets. So moving on, proper gain structure. This is going to be our first topic for sound check. Whenever you do a sound check, you always start with gain. And gain can be confusing and hard to describe because a lot of times people want to use gain interchangeably with volume. And gain and volume are extremely different. One affects the other, and the other does not affect one. So I have this graph up here, but first we'll read this yellow text. So gain is the measure of amplified signal we receive from the audio source, our instrument, at the audio controller, our soundboard, which is measured in dB or decibels. So if you look at the graph up here, we got a green circle and a red box. Audio source, that is our instrument. Whether it's a vocal, a guitar, a drum, a bass, doesn't matter. It's an audio source. We are sending gain, an amplified signal from that audio source through an XLR cable to our audio controller, which is our sound board. That is measured in decibels. Okay? So that's as far as we've gotten. That is what gain is. Volume, back to the yellow text, is the amount of signal we send from the audio controller, our soundboard, to our outputs, which is also measured in dB or decibels. So back to our little graph there. Once we have our gain from our audio source, we can then send a percentage of that gain, which is volume, to our outputs. And the white text up here is all of our different outs. Our DCA groups, our main speakers, foyer, cry room, live feed if we were live streaming or sending to the internet, in-ear monitors, and the subwoofer. And there's more. I mean, I don't know that we have more outputs than that, but I mean, your outs can be whatever your outs are. So gain is from your audio source to the controller, and volume is from your controller to your outs. Gain affects volume, but volume does not affect gain. So whatever I send to the board, whatever I send to my audio controller of gain is 100% of my volume. That is 100% of my volume. And then as I move my volume fader up and down, I am using a percentage of my volume. So if I have 10 apples of gain and I want to give 80% volume, I'm going to use 8 apples of volume. But if I leave the volume right there and I double my gain to 20, that is going to make my volume 16. Does that make sense? So yeah, so whatever your gain is always 100% of your volume. Doesn't matter what your gain is. It is always 100% of your volume. So if I increase that gain, whatever my percent of volume is also going to get increased with it. So gain affects volume. But the reverse is not true. I cannot change the percentage of gain that I've got by reducing the amount I'm giving away.
Question.
Yes?
You adjust the gain first before the volume, right? I mean, you want to adjust what's coming into the console first.
Yes.
And then your outs second.
Yes.
That depends on two things we talked about.
It does. We will get to reasons why you would do one or the other. But essentially, you need to make sure that you're getting enough amplified signal to your controller so that you can give enough volume from your controller. Okay? So we'll keep moving on because I think that if we get hung up here, it'll be difficult. I have other pictures. So we have a few pictures here in the white text. This is the first thing that should be set, which is gain. The channel should be wide open, and what do I mean by that? We're going to talk about other things tonight that you do in a sound check. Those are gates, dynamics, EQ, or compression. And those all affect my volume. And so I need to make sure that the channel is wide open or those things are not activated so that I'm hearing in volume what I'm getting in gain. Because if I have a compressor on which reduces my volume and I'm turning my gain up to compensate for that, and then later I go to adjust my compressor, all of a sudden I'm going to have way more volume. So this is the first thing, and if you don't understand that, that's fine because we're going to get to what those things are.
So what you mean by wide open is you don't have a gate, you don't have compression, you don't have any other
Correct.
thing on that channel. Okay.
Correct. Because I want to hear in volume exactly what I'm getting in gain. I don't want anything. Yeah. And there's a way to turn it on and off so you don't have to like lose your EQ information. You can just cycle it on and off. So yeah, but I want to hear exactly what I'm getting in gain and volume. You know, I don't want anything to alter it in between gain and volume. And the channel obviously needs to be unmuted because if my channel's muted, I'm not getting any volume. And this should never be changed during a live set. And I say never, and when I say never, I mean almost never. It should never be changed drastically because, like I said before, gain affects volume. And my volume, if I go back, is affecting all of my outs, right? Or my gain is affecting all of my outs, right? So if I go to turn the gain up because, hey, I need more volume in the house, I'm turning the volume up to all these things as I'm turning the gain up. And that includes in-ear monitors. And the only thing that we do here that is dangerous is in-ear monitors. If I go to turn that gain up so I can get more volume in the house mid-session, and all these people up here are wearing in-ear monitors, and I'm like, boom, 10 more decibels, I could permanently damage hearing. So when I say never, I mean almost never. But you can adjust gain plus or minus 2 or 3 decibels and it's usually not going to be noticed by the musicians on stage. And if it is, it will be like, that got a little quieter, or that got a little louder, and they'll adjust that or ask you. But it should never be adjusted more than that, because it's dangerous. It's dangerous for them, and it can have negative effects on your live set, that all of a sudden you could get feedback. If you have something EQ'd and you're accentuating a hertz frequency, it might be fine at that amount of gain. But then you go to turn the gain up, and all of a sudden it's not fine, and all of a sudden you're getting feedback. So there's really very few reasons why gain should ever be adjusted live, but you can do it if you absolutely have to, if it's clipping, if it's at the high end. But really it should almost never be. So I got some terms in different colors here. We have unity gain and unity volume. And what that means, by the way, when we're talking about unity gain and unity volume, we're not really using those terms technically correct, but in the industry, people use these terms for this all the time. So we're going to do it too. Unity gain, in the bar up top, this is the amount of signal, amplified signal, I'm getting to my audio controller. So you can see I have an arrow there that says unity to 0. 0 is always unity. And with volume on the right, I have the same thing with another yellow arrow. Where the 0 is, that is unity. So not complicated, that's just locations of those meters. The next thing down is clipping, which is in red, and you can see on the gain bar up top, it's the +4 clipping. I can only amplify a signal so much before it will start getting distorted. Picking up artifact or just being too much, and it starts becoming distorted. This actually is a desired sound in music, and it started in about the 40s with rock. People started turning volumes up really, really loud, and what they were doing, they were, guitar amps, they were turning them up really, really loud. And with the old analogs, gain and volume was kind of more interlinked, and so they'd turn it up really loud, and all of a sudden, hey man, that guitar is sounding interesting. I've never heard my guitar sound that way, and it's because they were getting the gain so high that it started to distort the signal, and all of a sudden they were like, man, this sounds really cool for a style of music we're going to call rock. And so now we have pedals and things that can augment this. Some amps will have a gain knob and a volume knob, because if I turn my gain knob all the way up, but I have my volume off, I can still play my guitar and not hear anything. And then as soon as I start touching my volume at all, I will get volume, but it will immediately be distorted because I've turned my gain up so much. So you hear distortion all the time. And it's literally the same thing that happens if we turn our gain up so much. We don't want to do that, obviously. You can get popping, you can get clicking, distortion doesn't sound good. Only sounds good when a guitar player wants it. There is debate about whether or not you should get your gain as close to unity as possible, or if you should only use enough gain to get your volume to unity as possible. And some of the videos that I sent you guys on the resource list, they say turn your fader to unity volume and turn your gain up until you get the amount of volume you want in your set. And there are good reasons for that. I personally have never tried that. I'm going to try it this weekend in rehearsal and see if I like it. The reason why is because I can very quickly look at the board and know whether or not everything should sound good. Because if all of my faders are at unity, I know that's probably pretty close to the way I intended it to sound. I come from a professional audio media recording background. And when you're recording, you always want as close to unity as possible without getting any clipping or popping or distortion, because it will give you the best end product to re-listen to. If I just had speakers in a room like this, and I turned my fader to unity, and then I gave it enough gain for it to be pleasant in here, but on the recording, I'm playing through much smaller speakers. I'm playing, so it's not going to sound the same. I'm going to get a weak signal, which is what's up there in blue. This is why I traditionally do not do it this way. But like I said, I'm going to try and see how it goes. I like to be in the headroom area because, and that is on our board, negative 18, negative 12, maybe a little bit more. I like being in that headroom area because I know without a shadow of a doubt, I'm probably not going to get a weak signal and I'm never going to clip. It's right in the middle. It's my happy place.
What is your desire? I mean, you said headroom. Where do you like to run?
So yeah, the green arrow up there, headroom. This one is a little different, but on ours, the headroom spot where the bar goes from green to yellow is about 18 to 12, negative 18 to negative 12.
6 and 8.
Mm-hmm. Right, which is
Where the arrow is.
yeah, which is a little bit more traditional, but the digital boards usually give you a broader range to work with. But really, it depends on the hardware you're using, honestly. If your hardware has a smaller range of decibels on its gain meter, then it's probably going to be up a little more. But if it has a wider range, it'll be down a little bit more. So yeah, headroom and weak signal. Weak signal, you might get the right amount of volume in the room, but you're really going to be pushing your faders almost all the way to the top of the board, and you're probably going to be pushing your groups to the top of the board. And even then, you'll get the volume, but it just doesn't quite sound right. There's just not enough power. It doesn't have any feel. It just doesn't sound right, and that is because you're not getting a true representation of the instrument because you're not receiving enough signal from it. So if you have a lot of volume to push, you might get it there, but it just won't sound right. So that's kind of gain. It's not terribly hard to get once you've done it a couple of times, but I will say that a lot of issues start with gain, but by the time you get through all of your sound check and you've started playing music and you've been messing with EQs and all that stuff, and then you've got a problem, it can be really hard to realize this problem is because I don't have my gain structure set up properly. And a lot of times that's what it is. It's not that I've EQ'd it weird or that I've got too harsh of a compressor on it or the gate's too... A lot of times I need to go all the way back to my gain and reset that. And that was honestly something that it took me a long time to realize. It took me a long time to learn that my music was not sounding the way I wanted it to, and I'm adjusting all these other complicated things when in reality I just need to set up my gain better. So, let's see. Next thing in a sound check is setting up gates. So, we got a picture here of the gate, and this is actually from the iPad app for our board. So this actually is our board. And then I got some text describing stuff, but we're going to read this white text first. So the gate acts as a sort of auto mute for a given audio source. If the audio source does not provide enough signal to the audio controller to open the gate, then the channel gives no signal. This allows for more control of the soundstage. So if I have the bass amp mic'd, which we do, obviously that microphone is going to pick up a lot of background sound. It's going to pick up my ambient room sound, which is people talking, having fun, laughing. It's also going to pick up all of my on-stage sound. The drums playing, people singing, people playing acoustic instruments. It's going to pick all that up. And so what a gate does is says, I don't want any of that. If it's too quiet, don't send me it. Only send me it when the signal's gotten strong enough, i.e. the bass player's actually playing. So all of that sound that I don't want in a room might be 70 decibels. Because I got a drummer playing right there, I've got an acoustic instrument playing right there, so it might be 70 decibels on the stage. But when my bassist actually hits a bass note and audio comes through that speaker and into that microphone, all of a sudden that signal has increased from 70 to 90 decibels. So I can set my gate at 80 decibels, and now I will only ever receive signal from that channel once I've gotten over 80, i.e. when the bass player is playing. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Do you do that on all the mics?
No, but not always, but most of them. Most of the time we do. Most of the time we do.
Especially vocals.
Yes.
Yeah, because you try to keep the instruments out of the vocals.
Yes, you're trying to keep your soundstage clean. What you're presenting to the audience or the congregation, you're trying to keep it clean. Certain situations where you need less gates are like a pastor's mic, because when a pastor's speaking, nothing else is happening. It's just the pastor. And so if I all of a sudden want to emphasize a point to you, and I do it through lowering my voice, and I've got a real harsh gate on that, all of a sudden I have no signal going to my huge room, and I've got a pastor that is literally whispering to people from the stage. So there are times when you don't need a gate, or if you do,
Compression,
that's different.
that's different.
That's different. We're going to talk about that next, actually. So there are times when gates are not as important, but you can still pretty much use them on almost any of your signals. But things that are hugely important on are drum mics, bass mics, vocal mics, really any mic on a stage is pretty important. So I have a graphic here to kind of help you understand that a little bit better. So the red line is room volume. That's just people talking. And that might be at 30, 40 decibels. And then I have stage volume. That's when people are playing. The drums are going, people are singing, people are playing. And that might be 70 decibels. And then I have my threshold, which is where I tell my audio controller, as soon as I get signal louder than this threshold, open up and send me what you got. So that might be at 80. And then I've got my audio source volume, which is always a range. It's never just 90 decibels, because I can play soft or I can play loud. And so it's always a range. And you always want to make sure that your gate is set below the lowest point of that range. Does that make sense? So just like when I'm talking, when I'm playing an instrument, I can either play an instrument this loud or I can play an instrument this loud. And if I have my gate set too high and I'm playing an instrument this loud, I might not get it. So I always want to make sure that I set my threshold lower than the lowest point that my musician is going to play. And so sometimes that means that I set my threshold low enough that I do pick up some stage volume. That is always the better option. It's always the better option to set your threshold lower so that you always get your instrument being played, but you also might pick up drums occasionally when they hit a crash or whatever, than to set it up so high that, oh man, I lost those couple of notes because it was too quiet. So this is kind of the graph that helps you understand this a little bit better. And some of this is honestly hard to understand until you start doing this on the board. And hopefully we're going to have some time tonight to show you in real time what these things do. So I've got some terms on the right side, and these are important to understand what they do, because these terms are used for other things in audio, but they mean different things when they're used in different settings. So threshold, the amount of signal at which the gate opens. The gate being when I receive signal, when I receive gain. Range is the amount of attenuation of the signal. Attenuation is another word for decrease. How much am I decreasing the signal? So how much am I decreasing the signal is range. Attack, how quickly the gate fully opens. So I've breached my threshold. How many milliseconds is it going to take for me to fully open the gate, fully receive the signal? Hold, how long the gate stays fully open. So I've received enough signal to break the gate. My attack has released, it's opened the gate fully, and now how long before I start closing the gate? So I've stopped receiving signal. How many milliseconds am I going to say, okay, close? And then release, how quickly the gate does close. Does it close real fast, or does it slowly close? And so where are we at? Slope. We're at slope. How harsh of a bend at the threshold? Slopes in gates don't have a huge effect audibly, but they're there. There's different types of slopes. I only ever use one in our setting because I just don't hear enough of a difference to ever use a different style of slope. But there are different slopes out there, and if you want to investigate those in your own time, feel free. But I use just one slope here. And then filter frequency. The hertz range frequency the gate is applied to. So if I'm setting a real harsh gate up on a bass guitar, then there's this huge spectrum, this huge range of hertz that I can have. And the bass is going to play in the lower end. Its fundamentals are going to be in the lower end of that hertz spectrum. And so if I have my filter frequency way up in the high range, that means my gate is sitting there going, nope, not opening. I'm waiting for high-end signal to come. So I could be playing bass and my gate is sitting there going, no, you're not getting through. I'm waiting for high-end. You're low-end. I'm not here for you. So you want to make sure that when you're setting a gate, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not like, oh, my fundamental is at 687 hertz. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be close. So that when I do start getting that type of signal, my gate's like, hey, that's it, we're opening. That is what I'm looking for. So the filter frequency is probably the most important thing when setting a gate. Because if you have that set wrong, your gate's not going to function properly. Some of these settings, like attack, hold, release, those things you can set super aggressive or you can set very slow. And for different reasons, you would set them, sorry, I don't have this muted, you would set them faster or slower. So if I want something to give me a lot of punch, a lot of like bass or kick, I'm going to set my attack and my release to be fairly quick. Because if I've got my signal attenuated, way down here, and my attack is slow, what's going to happen is all of a sudden I'm going to get this signal, which I have a graph for this actually. So right here. Let me start again because it'll be easier to follow this way. So the blue line is my input signal. That's what's coming into the microphone. And the red line is what I'm sending from my controller into my house speakers. So if I have a signal, so I've got all this blue line, which is just background sound, and then my bass guitar hits a note. And I've got this huge peak in signal in input, which is the blue line. And then you can see my attack is slower than my input signal. So what has happened is, instead of immediately getting output signal to match my input signal, it's taking time to get there. So it's bringing the volume up slowly in the room. And so that is going to be a gentler sound, something that is more pretty, something that's got more nuance to it. For vocals, keyboards, electric guitars, slower attacks, because I want it to come in more gently. If I have a kick drum and that thing is hitting me in the chest, I want it to hit me in the chest. So as soon as I get that boom of input, I want that boom of output.
At 0.
Yeah, you can do it at 0.
So is this a way to cut out like the pick? Because I know sometimes when people play, depending on their picking, strumming, you get a lot of that pick sound.
Not really. And the reason why is because once my gate is open, I'm getting, it's letting it all in.
So that's the guitar itself.
Yeah. So I'm either holding back all the water, or I'm not. And then my attack and my release is how quickly I'm letting that water out and how quickly I'm stopping it from going out. So once a gate's open, it's open. I'm getting all the signal, which means I'm getting my stage sound, I'm getting my background sound. All of that's coming in because the gate's been opened. But Once I've opened the gate, I'm sending a much louder signal through. So what am I going to hear? I'm going to hear the much louder signal. Sure, it's going to muddy up the stage, the sound stage a bit because I'm getting all that background sound in. But where it does clean up your sound stage a lot is when I'm not playing or when I'm not singing, when I'm not hitting, that tom. I've got all these microphones in the drum cage. I've got 7, 8 of them in there. And if all of them are constantly transmitting, I'm going to get a whole lot of phasing issues where I'm knocking signals out or I'm amplifying signals. But if I have real harsh gates on all of these mics, then odds are I'm going to not get a lot of that signal until that drummer hits that specific tom. So, in certain settings, if I want something to be punchy, if I want it to hit a brick wall and then be like, bam, hit me in the face, harsh attack, harsh release. If I want it to be more nuancey, more gradual, more comfortable, then I'll do a longer attack, a longer release. So you can see on the right side where it says range, my input volume is still that blue line. So if I had no gate on this, I would constantly hear that through volume. I would constantly hear that amount of my output would match. But because my hold has ended and my release has started, I've started attenuating, decreasing that volume to nothing. So eventually my gate has closed. Eventually I'm going to get all of that out of my house speakers. I'm not going to get that on my soundstage. And these timelines, you got to remember, these are in milliseconds. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Some boards, the attacks and the release can go up to a full second, but usually we're talking milliseconds. You would be surprised at how much it does change the overall sound. Just milliseconds to your ear. I mean, your brain is super complex with hearing. The amount of data you can pick up in fractions of a second is incredible. Like if I have a pair of house speakers here and I set some smaller speakers in the back of the room here to make sure that it sounds the same, I've got to delay that signal a certain amount of milliseconds based on the amount of distance I'm going. And if I don't do that, you're going to notice. It's going to be a huge deal. So milliseconds, they actually do make a big difference.
So you can tell direction too.
Yeah, that's right. Direction. The difference, your right ear hears from your left ear. And if that is 10 milliseconds, then you can tell which side somebody is on based on that information. If you're deaf in one ear, you really can't tell where any audio is coming from at all, because the only way you can tell direction is by that difference in milliseconds. So that's a gate. It's honestly probably the most simple thing we use as far as setting gains, setting compressors, and setting your EQs. Gates are pretty simple.
Okay, so you have a vocalist, they're singing. Are you going to go through the trouble, the time? The gain's pretty quick. Honestly, if you do unity gain and you're in a room and you want to, you can get it up to wherever you want, and you're probably okay. Then you're going to go to a gate. Are you going to spend a lot of time on that gate?
Most of the time, no.
You're trying to sing, you're going to sing a song. What are your...
So the way that I set up a gate quickly, I've set my gain, I'm happy with it. And by the way, regardless of whether or not your fader is at unity gain, it needs to be somewhere, because I have to be able to hear what I'm doing with the gain. So regardless of whether or not you've set it to unity or it's in the middle, I like to set my faders where I think they should be for stage volume so that I can have room to go up and room to go down. So regardless of where that is for you, they need to be somewhere so that I can hear. It's not just about turning the gain up until it gets to where I want to see it. That is a part of it, but I also need to hear what it's doing. What impact is it having? So yes, when I'm after I've adjusted my gain and I go to adjust my gate, the simplest, fastest way to do it is while they're singing, while they're playing on the digital boards, there's this line, there's this line right here, and there will be a little blue square that is jumping up and down. Wherever that hits the lowest point while they're singing or playing, I know my threshold is below that. So I just set my threshold a little bit below that, and I move on. Because I know more likely than not, I'm not going to get a problem, and I've knocked out 90% of the background sound.
But you haven't affected or haven't set time for attack and release and slope and
Right. I mean,
frequency range, and you haven't done all that.
right. You generally don't, because a bass channel here is always a bass channel. We're not a concert hall where we're constantly changing who's on what channels. So my bass channel is always my bass channel. My filter frequency, it should be the same. I'm not changing that from week to week, really. You know.
A lot of that's pre-done.
Yeah.
Has been done for weeks.
Right.
Months, or years, or whatever.
Right. But if we were a concert hall or a theater and we're changing what we're miking on what channel, all this stuff needs to be done new every time. You know, and this stuff can change over time too. Just because I've got it set some way or the board's got it set some way.
We have a new guitar guy almost every week.
Yeah. You can change stuff. You can change stuff. Don't
It's
I
about the same.
yeah, I never want you to walk in here thinking this is the way Jeff has it, I can't change it. Because this stuff doesn't belong to me. So, different types of compression. So, we've gone through gain and gate, now we're moving on to compression. There's a lot of different styles of compression, and we're going to talk about two. And really the two that we're choosing are the ones on the outside, and then there's a bunch of things in the middle. And so let's do this. This again is a picture of the screen on our particular board. So this is what it will look like. And you can see there's a bunch of information up there. So let's read this white text together. The compressor acts as an audio controller. Therefore, our channel is our audio source. So before, we had an audio source, an instrument, going to our audio controller, which was our board. Now that we're putting it into a compressor, our board has become our audio source, and our compressor has become our audio controller. Okay?
So gain is critical from the start.
Gain is critical from the start. Gain is critical from the start. And you can see actually in this picture, bottom right corner, it says gain, 0.00 dB. Because audio controllers have gain. Okay, so that's going to be important. So the compressor squeezes audio signals from both the top and the bottom. This provides a more consistent volume. And we've got a bunch of terms here. But I've got a graph on the next slide we'll look at to help you understand a little bit. So the left side is uncompressed audio with loud peaks and quiet lows. And on the right side, we have compressed audio with more consistent volume. And on the sides of these graphs, you can see decibel meters from -16 to +3. And so I've taken the same audio signal, the same audio source, and I've applied a compressor on it, and it's squished that down. So now instead of having peaks at +4 decibels close to clipping, I'm at -2 decibels, well into the headroom range. And my bottom ends are not totally dropping out. I'm not losing them to my gate or to ambient sound in the room because they're way down in the -20s. Now they're -15. So I've compressed my audio source. And when I do this, I lose overall gain. That is why a compressor is an audio controller, why it has gain. Because when I compress audio, not only am I squishing the signal, I'm also decreasing the amount of gain I'm getting from that source. So the more that I compress an audio signal, the more gain I have to add to make up for what I've lost. So I've got a gain coming from my audio source to my audio controller, which is my board. And then I've got another gain between my board, which has now become my audio signal, and my compressor, which is now my audio controller. The big difference is that if I have a vocal mic coming to the board, my gain is going to be set maybe at 32 decibels. and then I compress that signal, I'm not going to put my gain on my compressor to 32 decibels. I mean, you're going to destroy the speakers. When I've compressed it, I've lost maybe 4 decibels. So I'm going to add that 4 decibels back in from my compressor. Because if I add it from my board, I've essentially uncompressed the compressed signal that I just compressed. So I'm not getting more volume, I'm just getting more peaks again. Because I've increased what I've put into that. So it's pushed my squish open again. That's kind of not a super technical way to describe that, but I think it works for understanding. So you can also use gain in a compressor to make sure that your quiet stuff isn't quite so quiet. So it's not just I've lost some gain. You can add in what you've lost, but then I can add a little bit more on top of that.
That's what I've seen.
Yeah.
When they do compression, they bring it up, they control it completely, but they bring it up to where they can hear it all the time.
Right. Right. And so that's why it is called a compressor, because it's compressing from both sides. If I couldn't compress the bottom, I don't know that it would be right term to say we're compressing it. But so yeah, so the gain in a compressor is super important. There's a lot of other things that are important with compressors, but it's obviously pretty important. So let's go over some key terms before I continue. So these terms are the same terms that we used for a gate, but here they mean different things. Some of them mean the same, but some of them don't. So threshold, amount of signal at which division begins. So with a gate, the threshold was the amount of signal at which my gate opens. This is at the amount of signal at which division begins. So when I'm compressing a signal, I'm telling the compressor that when the signal reaches this threshold, start dividing it into smaller signals. And I have a diagram here that we're going to look at later, but I want to get through these things. So, but you can see the division happening in the color lines. So ratio is the amount of division of the signal. Attack, how quickly the signal is compressed. Hold, how long the compression lasts. Release, how quickly the signal is uncompressed. Gain, amount of amplified signal from the audio source. Knee, how harsh of a bend at the threshold. And key filter, hertz range frequency the compressor is applied to. And the important thing to note about the key filter is that it's reverse from the gate. So that the gate, I'm setting a key filter here, and I'm saying anything outside of this I don't want. Whereas with a compressor, I'm saying I'm setting the key filter here, and when I get signal here, I want to reduce it. So whereas the gate is saying when I get this signal, open up, the compressor is saying when I get this signal, clamp it down a bit. So they're reverse, the key filters. You would still set them in the same place. Just the concept is
Attack, hold, release mean exactly the opposite.
Yes, exactly. Yep. So it's important to understand that those terms do mean something else, so that when you're setting these things, you know what you're doing to your signal. So we'll move on to this other graph to kind of help better understand that. So there's 2 types of compression that we're talking about tonight, and there's a lot of things that fit between these 2. There's limiter style compression and there's gentle compression. So limiter style compression, good for spoken word. Potentially volatile sources like drums, limiter style compression can be good for that stuff. But some drawbacks, you lose clarity of the signal and you decrease nuance, right? So our voices are very complex instruments. The types of hertz ranges that my voice will produce when I sing is very complex. I've got a lot of fundamentals, but I also have a lot of tones that are coming through. Whereas a well-constructed instrument will have, 3 or so fundamentals and then very specific tones coming in and not a whole lot else. Our voices are more complex than that. They put off a lot more. So if I put a limiter style compressor on it, I'm going to lose some of those things. I'll still get my fundamentals, but I'm going to lose some of my nuance in my voice. With this style of compressor, I'm going to use a higher threshold because my signal can get up louder before I start compressing really harsh, right? Another problem with this is that it can cause pops and distortion. If I have a true limiter on, which we're not talking about, a true limiter is the red line. As soon as you hit this threshold, you cannot get louder. So that's a true limiter. And when I use a true limiter, if I've got my threshold too low and that signal's coming in and it hits a brick wall going 70 miles an hour, that's going to make some sound. That's going to give me some artifacts, some popping, clicking, distortion. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that I've got to open up my ratio, but it does mean that I either have to do that or I have to increase my threshold. Increase my threshold or open up my, I think I said that, open up my ratio. So that's kind of limiter style compression. My background, we used a lot of limiter style compression because what we recorded was speakers giving PowerPoint presentations. And so sometimes you had people that just talked real monotone, but then you had, what's that?
That's what you recorded?
Yeah, speakers and like for business conferences, like doctors, home builders, law offices, So yeah, they're the worst people to record. By the way, it's very stressful. But then you have people like me who really like to use our voices to make a point. And so limiter style compression is great for that. If you look on the board for the sermon channel, we're using limiter style because it changes from week to week. Who's talking? And I want to make sure I've got a lot of control over that. They're not live in house. They're not here all the time. Jonathan is very verbose at times. He can get very excited, very loud. And so I need to control that. And he can also sometimes get really quiet to prove a point. And I need to make sure that I'm using my compression in a way that complements both of those things. So that is kind of what limiter style compression looks like. I would say limiter style compression would be like the 4:1 ratio, the orange bar, or harsher. And then a gentle compression is good for vocals, softer sources like piano, guitar, violin. You don't get as much control, right? The signal has more room to go places. If I've got a 1.5 to 1 ratio, then my signal can get a lot higher in-house before, because it just has more room to grow. Even though I'm dividing the signal, it still has room to grow. Whereas on my 4:1, it doesn't have a whole lot of room to grow. I've divided the signal so much that it just can't get that loud. So I get less control. But, so like I've got potential for spikes. That's less control. I can spike in audio real quick. But I can use a lower threshold, and I retain a lot of those nuances we were talking about. I retain a lot of clarity. This is very prominent in vocalists, with Megan's voice especially. If I like to do gentle compression. So I'll do like a 1.5 to 1 or a 2 to 1, and I'll throw my threshold way below the high end of her voice so that it starts dividing the signal much quicker. But then when she gets real powerful in a chorus, it's not hurting me, but I've retained all of the nuance of her voice, all the different tones in her voice.
Aaron's very dynamic too.
Mm-hmm.
Song to song, he changes totally.
Mm-hmm. So these are the two kind of outside ends, gentle and limiter, and there's a lot of room in between. And this particular graph makes it look like you can only go to 4:1 or true limiter, but different hardware has different things, and our board, it gives you a lot of options. I think wide open is 1.1 to 1, and it'll go all the way to like 20 to 1 or something before it goes to a true limiter. So you get a lot of options. And so this is the division we were talking about earlier when I was saying ratio, the amount of division of the signal. So You can see I've got output level on the left going vertically, and then horizontally I've got input level. So as my signal's coming in, if I've got on a 4:1 ratio, that means that as my signal grows, it has to grow 4 decibels, 4 boxes, before it goes up 1 decibel of output. So that's what I'm talking about with division. Does that make sense?
It's a percentage.
Yep. Exactly. 2:1 would be 50%. I've divided it in half. So once I've gotten over my threshold, I'm only getting half of my signal at that point. So the harsher I put that, the more I'm dividing. Let's see what time. Oh, good. We got plenty of time. So those are the big things in sound check. Obviously, we did not talk about EQ. Our next class will discuss that. And EQing is very personal and complex, and it takes the most amount of skill because you have to be able to hear things. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that. But so that is the big things when it comes to sound check.